I stood in the back corner of St. Mary's Cathedral, watching the last mourners file past my grandfather's casket. The February snow had turned to slush outside, and people tracked it across the marble floors, leaving dark streaks that looked like tears. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood what had really happened. My grandfather, Thomas Chen, was 78 years old when he died. The doctors said it was complications from Parkinson's disease. Natural causes. Expected. I wanted to believe them. I tried to believe them, but something in my gut wouldn't let me accept it. I'm Claire. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant in Springfield, Massachusetts. My job is finding patterns where others see chaos, spotting discrepancies in numbers that tell stories people don't want told. Maybe that's why I noticed things others missed at the funeral. The way my Aunt Margaret's hands shook when she accepted condolences. The expensive Cartier watch on her wrist that she definitely couldn't afford 6 months ago. The way she kept checking her phone during the eulogy. The crowd thinned. My aunt stood by the casket, playing the grieving sister-in-law to perfection. My cousin David had flown in from Seattle that morning. We hugged briefly. Two people who grew up close but let geography and careers pull us apart. He had his wife and 2 kids with him now. A whole life I only saw through Christmas cards and Facebook updates. I was about to leave when a man in a dark suit approached me. Mid-50s, gray at the temples, carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than I was. Miss Chen? Claire Chen? I nodded. I'm Robert Patterson. I was your grandfather's attorney. He glanced around the nearly empty cathedral. I need to speak with you privately. It's urgent. Can't this wait? We're heading to my aunt's house for the reception. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Fear? Warning? Please, it cannot wait. Your grandfather was very specific about the timing. He lowered his voice. And Miss Chen, don't mention this conversation to anyone in your family. Not your aunt, not your cousin, no one. Your grandfather's words, not mine. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. What are you talking about? The carriage house behind your grandfather's estate. Can you meet me there in 20 minutes? Come alone. Before I could respond, he walked away, disappearing through a side door. I should have questioned it more. I should have demanded answers right there. But my grandfather was a careful man, a deliberate man. He'd been a mechanical engineer his whole career, designing components for aerospace systems. Everything he did had a reason, a purpose. If he'd left instructions with his attorney, there was something he needed me to know. I told my cousin I'd meet him at Aunt Margaret's house later, said I needed some air, some time alone. He understood. Or at least, he pretended to. The drive to my grandfather's house took 15 minutes through streets I'd known my whole childhood. The estate sat on 3 acres outside town, a Victorian-era house with a converted carriage house in back. My grandfather had used the carriage house as his workshop for as long as I could remember. It's where he'd taught me to solder circuit boards when I was 10, where we'd built a radio from scratch the summer I was 14. I pulled into the circular driveway. The main house looked empty, dark. My aunt had been staying there the past 6 months, supposedly to help care for my grandfather. She'd moved in after his Parkinson's diagnosis made living alone difficult. The carriage house door was unlocked. Inside, Robert Patterson sat at my grandfather's old workbench, a laptop open in front of him. Lock the door behind you, he said. I did. Your grandfather came to see me 8 weeks ago, Patterson began. He was lucid, sharp, no signs of cognitive decline despite his physical symptoms. He said he needed to update his will, but more importantly, he said he needed to document something. He said if anything happened to him, I was to show you this. He turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a video file dated January 3rd, 2 weeks before my grandfather died. Patterson pressed play. My grandfather appeared on screen, seated in his wheelchair, but his eyes were alert, focused. He looked directly into the camera like he was looking right at me. Claire, if you're watching this, I'm gone. And if Robert is showing you this, it means my suspicions were correct. He paused, took a shaky breath. I'm being poisoned. I believe it's Margaret. Your aunt. My late wife's sister. My stomach dropped. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the workbench. My grandfather continued. 3 months ago, I started feeling worse. Not the normal Parkinson's progression. Different. Nausea, confusion, stomach pain. I researched the symptoms. They matched arsenic poisoning. I stopped accepting the tea Margaret made me every evening, told her the Parkinson's made swallowing difficult. She seemed annoyed but accepted it. He leaned forward slightly. Then my medications started affecting me strangely. The pills looked the same, but the side effects were wrong. I'm an engineer, Claire. I know when variables don't match expected outcomes. So I tested it. I set up a hidden camera. He gestured off screen, behind the bookshelf, aimed at my medication organizer. The video cut to security footage. Grainy, but clear enough. My aunt, standing at my grandfather's dresser, opening his medication organizer. She glanced at the door, then pulled a small vial from her purse. Carefully, methodically, she ground several pills into powder, then refilled the empty capsules with whatever was in her vial. She did this with 4 different medications. The video cut back to my grandfather. I had the original pills tested at a private lab. The results are in the envelope Robert is holding. Arsenic trioxide, small doses. Enough to accumulate over time, to mimic disease progression, to kill me slowly. I looked at Patterson. He handed me a manila envelope. Inside were laboratory reports, timestamps, chemical analyses. Everything documented with engineering precision. Why? My voice cracked. Why would she do this? Patterson's face was grim. May I? He gestured to the laptop. I nodded. He opened several files. Bank statements. Margaret's bank statements. The numbers told a story I recognized from my work. Mounting debts, cash advances, wire transfers to online gambling sites. In the past year alone, she'd lost over $200,000. Your grandfather discovered this 2 months ago, Patterson explained. He'd given Margaret access to some accounts to help manage bills during his illness. She'd been skimming, but small amounts. He was going to confront her, cut her off. Then he found the real problem. He opened another document. A copy of my grandfather's will from 5 years ago, standard distribution. Everything split equally between his 2 grandchildren, David and me. Margaret wasn't mentioned because she wasn't blood family, and my grandfather had already been generous to her over the years. Helped with her divorce, paid off her mortgage once, covered medical bills. Margaret knew she was getting nothing, I said slowly. The pieces falling into place like a solved equation. She needed him dead before he cut her off completely. Worse, Patterson said. We found this in her emails. He showed me a printed exchange between Margaret and someone named Rita Sandoval, the home health aide Margaret had hired to help with my grandfather's care. They'd discussed forging a new will, leaving everything to Margaret as compensation for her caregiving. They were waiting for my grandfather to become confused enough, compromised enough, that they could claim he'd changed his mind in his final days. But my grandfather was smarter than that. He'd documented everything, the cameras, the lab tests, bank records. Patterson had copies of all of it, along with instructions to contact the police if my grandfather died under suspicious circumstances. Why wait until now? I demanded. Why let him die? Patterson's expression turned pained. He didn't want to believe it at first. Margaret was family, had been part of his life for 30 years. He kept thinking there was another explanation. By the time he accepted the truth and set all this up with me, the damage was done. The doctors said his organs were already failing. Too much exposure over too long. He had weeks, maybe a month. He spent that time building the case instead of his defense. I felt tears finally coming. Hot, angry tears. He died protecting evidence. He died protecting you. And your cousin. Making sure Margaret couldn't contest the will, couldn't claim the estate, couldn't hurt anyone else. I looked at the screen, at my grandfather's frozen image. He'd faced his own murder with the same methodical approach he'd brought to every problem in his life. Break it down, document the variables, solve for truth. What do we do now? I asked. Now, we call the police. But your grandfather had specific instructions about that too. Patterson pulled out another document. He wanted to make sure we had irrefutable evidence. He suggested we document Margaret attempting the same crime one more time, now that she thinks she's succeeded. I understood immediately. We set a trap. Your grandfather's idea, not mine. But yes, he set up similar cameras throughout the house. If Margaret and her accomplice try to forge documents, move assets, or destroy evidence, we'll catch them. Your grandfather wanted Margaret to incriminate herself so thoroughly that no lawyer could save her. Even dead, my grandfather was still engineering solutions. We spent the next hour planning. Patterson would inform the family that my grandfather's estate needed to go through probate, standard procedure. This would give us time. Margaret wouldn't make any moves yet. She'd wait for the formal will reading, play the grieving family member, then act shocked when she learned she was getting nothing. That's when she'd panic. That's when she'd try to fix it. I drove to my aunt's house for the reception, forcing myself to smile, to accept hugs, to eat casseroles that tasted like cardboard. Margaret played her role perfectly. She talked about how much my grandfather would be missed, how she'd devoted the last 6 months to his care, how hard it had been watching him decline. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her by her expensive collar and shake her until the truth fell out, but I didn't. I thought about my grandfather, working alone in his workshop, documenting his own murder with the same patience he'd used to teach me engineering principles. If he could wait, I could wait. David pulled me aside at one point. "You okay? You seem distant." "Just processing," I said. "It wasn't a lie. This hasn't really hit me yet." He squeezed my shoulder. His kids were running around the living room, oblivious to the grief. "I'm heading back to Seattle tomorrow. Work won't give me more than 3 days. But call me if you need anything, okay?" I nodded. David and I weren't as close as we'd been as kids, but we were still family, real family, the kind that didn't dissolve when geography intervened. I made a mental note to visit him more often after this was over, to be present in my niece and nephew's lives, to not let distance be an excuse. 3 days later, Patterson called the family for the will reading. We met at his office downtown. Margaret wore black, still playing the widow-adjacent role. David had already flown home, so he attended via video call. Patterson read the will, standard legal language, then the distribution. Everything split 50-50 between David and me. My grandfather's house, his investments, his patents, his savings. It totaled nearly $3 million. Margaret's face went through a fascinating evolution: shock, disbelief, then carefully controlled rage. "There must be a mistake," she said, her voice tight. "Thomas promised me. For all the care I provided, he said he'd take care of me." "I have the original will, signed and witnessed," Patterson said calmly. "Last updated 5 years ago. There are no amendments. But I have medical bills. I gave up 6 months of my life. I deserve compensation." "That's not how wills work, Miss Harper." She stood abruptly. "This isn't over. I'll contest this." Thomas wasn't in his right mind at the end. The Parkinson's affected his judgment. "The will was signed 5 years ago, before his diagnosis," Patterson reminded her. "You're welcome to contest it, but I should warn you that probate contests are expensive and rarely successful." She left without another word. Now we waited. Patterson had reactivated all my grandfather's security systems, cameras in every room of the main house, audio recording in the carriage house. My grandfather had been paranoid about workshop security after someone broke in years ago and stole tools. That paranoia was about to pay dividends. I stayed at a hotel, but I drove past the house every day. Margaret's car was always there. She'd moved in supposedly to care for my grandfather, and apparently saw no reason to leave now. On the 4th day after the will reading, she made her move. The security system sent an alert to Patterson's phone at 2 in the morning. Someone was in the carriage house. We'd left certain documents there deliberately. Templates, blank letterhead with my grandfather's name, official-looking estate paperwork. Bait. Patterson called the police, then called me. By the time I arrived, patrol cars were already pulling up. We watched on Patterson's tablet as Margaret and Rita, the health aide, hunched over the workbench. They'd set up a portable scanner and printer. They were creating a new will. The police entered quietly. Margaret tried to run. Rita started crying immediately. The arrest was swift, the evidence overwhelming. But it was what the police found during the search of Margaret's belongings that made the case ironclad. She'd kept a diary, a detailed, dated diary of every dose, every symptom. Every day, my grandfather grew weaker. She documented it like a science experiment, which, in a way, it was. The trial happened 8 months later. The prosecution had everything: video evidence of medication tampering, lab results showing arsenic in both the pills and my grandfather's remains after exhumation, bank records showing motive, the forged will attempt showing consciousness of guilt, and Margaret's diary, where she'd written things like, "Tea seemed weaker today, excellent progress, and needs to last another month to be convincing." Rita took a plea deal, testified against Margaret, said Margaret had promised her $50,000 from the estate for helping, said she'd been scared to refuse because Margaret had threatened to report her for immigration violations that didn't actually exist. Margaret's lawyer tried everything, claimed the diary was fiction, therapeutic writing, claimed the videos were doctored, claimed my grandfather had given her permission to handle his medications. None of it held up. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: murder in the first degree, attempted fraud, forgery. The judge sentenced her to 20 years to life. Rita got 10 years as an accomplice, with possibility of parole after 7. I sat in the courtroom and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, just emptiness where my grandfather should have been. After it was over, Patterson and I went through my grandfather's papers properly. We found more letters, one addressed to me. "Claire, you were always the problem solver, the one who looked at evidence instead of believing comfortable lies. I'm sorry to burden you with this truth, but I knew you could handle it. You were the only one I could trust to see this through. Thank you for being my granddaughter. Thank you for seeking justice. Now go live a life that would make me proud. Thomas." I used part of my inheritance to establish a foundation, the Thomas Chen Center for Elder Abuse Prevention. We fund research, support prosecutions, provide resources for families worried about their aging relatives. In the first year alone, we helped investigate 12 cases. 5 resulted in criminal charges. David and I split the house. He didn't want it, too many memories and too far from Seattle, so I bought out his half. I spent 6 months renovating, erasing Margaret's presence, restoring it to the way it was when my grandmother was alive. The carriage house became the foundation's headquarters. I still work as a forensic accountant, but now I specialize in elder financial abuse cases. I use the same skills that helped me understand Margaret's crime to help other families protect their loved ones. David and I talk every Sunday now, video calls with his kids. I fly to Seattle for birthdays and holidays. We're not going to lose each other to distance again. Some nights, I sit in the carriage house workshop, in the same chair where my grandfather recorded his final message. I think about how he faced death with clarity and courage, how he chose to spend his last weeks building evidence instead of seeking treatment, how he engineered his own justice from beyond the grave. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry, if I hate my aunt for what she did. I tell them the truth. I feel nothing for Margaret Harper. She made a choice based on greed and desperation. She murdered someone who'd shown her nothing but kindness. She documented her own crime because she was so certain she'd get away with it. My grandfather taught me that systems fail when people stop paying attention. He taught me that truth reveals itself when you measure carefully enough. He taught me that sometimes you have to engineer your own justice because no one else will do it for you. I carry those lessons with me every day. The foundation just helped a woman in Connecticut whose mother's caregiver had been stealing her medication and selling it. The evidence we gathered led to an arrest. The mother is recovering now, safe with her daughter. That's my grandfather's legacy. Not the money, or the house, or the patents, but the reminder that when you see something wrong, you document it, you build the case, you don't look away. 3 years later, I still visit his grave every month. I bring flowers and tell him about the foundation's work. I tell him about the people we've helped. I tell him that his death wasn't meaningless, that he turned his murder into a blueprint for saving others. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the carriage house late at night, I can almost hear him. "Good work, Claire. Now solve the next one." So I do. I solve the next one, and the next one, and the one after that. Because that's what engineers do. We see problems, and we fix them. My grandfather taught me that, in life and in death, and in the careful, deliberate way he documented both. His last engineering project was his own justice, and it was perfect.